Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Saskatchewan Retirees Association webcast. My name is Randy Dove. I'm the president of the Saskatchewan Retirees Association. We're happy to have you join us today. I know we had over 100 people register for this event, and this is the second in a series that we've been running, and so we're very happy to have you join us. I also want to acknowledge that the land where this webcast originates is Treaty 4 territory, and we also acknowledge Treaties 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10, traditional territory of Indigenous peoples and the homeland of the Métis. The SRA mandates provide services and support to meet the needs of retiring provincial government employees and agencies. We now have 3,750 members and growing each year, and so we're very pleased for your support. And we also recognize that we have now over 70 organizational members that have been approved. And so that's also a growing number. And so that's a tribute to your support and your efforts to help us make sure we reach other people that are approaching retirement. Strengths Together, one of the things that we talk about as a bit of a tagline, gives us an opportunity to do things as a collective group and allows us to participate on your behalf at our board of directors, and hopefully that our board and our committees meet your needs. We surveyed members earlier this year, and for those of you who were on our previous webcast, you'll know this, but for people joining us today, we did survey our members and got information from you as to what you would ask the SRA to do in the future. 1,600 people responded to that survey. We're very pleased with that response. It's pushing 50% of our membership, and so clearly sends us some strong messages about what you as individuals would like us to do. You told us that you wanted more communication, you wanted opportunities to dialogue with us, you wanted us to consider specific topics and provide information to you. And so what this webcast, as I mentioned, is a continuation. And later in this cast, you will see some additional topics that we plan to present in the near future. We're also today very pleased to welcome two dynamic speakers who are going to talk to us about generic drugs and facts and myths. And so we're pleased to welcome them. They'll be introduced in a couple of minutes to provide some thoughts for you to consider. We will be responding to questions as we move along. If you've got a question, you can put it in the question box on the right side of your screen. When we come to that, we will be identifying members by first name only, so you'll know when your question is put forward. They will be grouped together so that we can make sure that we have as many questions as possible go to our two speakers during the time we're together. All of the information from the webcast, including the recording of it and the questions that come from you, will go up on our website in due course, and the actual recording will go up on YouTube once we're finished this broadcast or this webcast. The previous one had last time I checked, had over 600 views, and so it was clear that some of you went to YouTube and had a look at the one that was the one around PIBA and the changes that are happening there. So we invite you to do the same here with this one when it's done, and each of ours, as we move forward, will also end up on the on YouTube and be available through our website. As far as the questions and that, we have a person with us today, Lyle Fluter. Lyle is going to be looking after the questions. So when they come in through the question area, Lyle will be looking at them, grouping them together, and he will then ask on your behalf, on our behalf, of our two speakers, so that we can again get as many questions as possible in. Just a little bit of information about sort of the current situation with what's been happening with our group benefits plan. It was introduced in 1998 to provide members with the opportunity to continue health and dental coverage into their retirement. From that date forward, the SRA board has had a group benefits committee. And the group benefits committee is charged with looking at the group benefits plan and making sure that it makes sense from a coverage point of view and from an affordability point of view. And again, part of this dialogue is to help that group also make some decisions as we move into the 23-24 period for the plan. Over the past 5 years, the health plan has had over 10% of growth in terms of members. As a result of that also increased growth brings increased revenue. It also brings increased claims. And so at this stage, we now have about 58% of our overall health claims are attributed to prescription drugs. That amounts to about 162,000 drug claims in a renewal year. Our renewal year is from July to June. And in recent times, that's about $2.5 million in claims. So it's a significant part of what happens with the premium that you pay in terms of providing that support to you. And so in looking at that, 58% of our costs or our claims are going to prescription drugs. We wanted to look at what options there might be available and how we might stabilize or moderate or even reduce the cost of that plan to you. And so one of the alternatives that we decided to look at, and why we're here today, is provide you with some information about the whole question of generic drugs and whether or not that's a direction that we should be pursuing. From what we understand, and this will be explored more between you and our speakers in a few minutes, is that we could at least perhaps slow the costs of our premiums if we went down this path. And there's many ways to go down this path, whether it be optional, whether it be mandatory, whether it be some combination, or whether or not we go down this path at all. And that's why we're curious to have your views on this. So there's lots of information about generic drugs. Some of it is truthful, some of it is misinformation. So when we said we want to debunk the myths about generic drugs, what we mean is we'd like to present through our presenters the opportunity for you to understand what's really happening with generic medications. And I think too many of us, myself included, spend too much time surfing around and picking up bits and pieces, whether it's on social media or Google or wherever. And sometimes I think it's important that we step back and see what's really happening. And so that's what we're here. That's what we're about. And I think with that, I'm going to now introduce Harold Hug. Harold is the Vice President of our board at the SRA, and he's the chair of the Group Benefits Committee. Harold's here to introduce our speakers, and I'd ask Harold now to introduce our first speaker. So over to you, Harold, please.
All right. Thanks, Randy. As Randy mentioned, good afternoon. My name is Harold Hug, and I'm Vice President of the Saskatchewan Retirees Association and Chair of the Group Benefits Committee. And it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker today is Aaron Yakuchuk, an assistant professor from the University of Saskatchewan. Aaron is assistant professor in the College of Pharmacy and Nutrition at the University of Saskatchewan and a clinical pharmacist with the Generic Evaluation and Management Program at Saskatoon City Hospital. Aaron is a board-certified generic pharmacist, and her teaching, research, and practice interests include optimizing the health and function of older adults through appropriate medication use and multidisciplinary team-based healthcare. Welcome, Aaron, to our information series for SRA members.
Thanks very much, Harold, for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining in today to discuss this important and often misunderstood topic. So I'm excited to have the chance to delve into some of the facts as well as the myths behind using generic medications, hopefully help to dispel some of these myths, and then answer any questions that you might have about generic medications as well. So objectives, what I'm hoping that you'll take away from this session today. I hope that by the end of our time together, you're able to discuss the difference between branded as well as generic medications, summarize how generic medications are approved in Canada, explain the role of generic medications in our healthcare system, and dispel some of the common myths about generic medications. So basically, the first three objectives will hopefully feed into the fourth. And by the time we get to the facts and myths, I hope you'll be prepared to almost debunk them with me as we go through them. All right, so there is definitely a perception that generic medications are less effective as well as less safe than brand name medications. And I think there's several possible reasons for this. If we take a step further back and look at our experience as consumers of other brand name versus generic products, I think many of us, myself included, would say that often our experience with generic products, for example, generic toilet paper or generic facial tissue, is that often the generic is inferior to the brand name product. So the brand name product in those contexts often does have a little bit of a higher quality, and that also helps to justify the higher price point. As well, companies spend a lot of money on advertising and marketing. So this is true of drug companies as well as most other companies. And the hope for this is to cultivate brand loyalty. So they want us to feel a sense of loyalty to their brands and their products. So we continue to purchase from them as opposed to other sources. There's also a really interesting phenomenon called the marketing placebo effect. And this refers to the fact that studies have shown that we tend to value expensive items more than their less expensive counterparts. So a few really interesting studies have been done on this topic with respect to wine. So individuals that are given a bottle of wine and told that it's a nice, relatively expensive $40 bottle of wine are more likely to rate the wine as being of high quality, of being very tasty. They're more likely to enjoy the wine. Studies have also found that that same bottle of wine given to people who are told that it is a less expensive $10 bottle of wine, they tend to rate the wine as less satisfactory. So they enjoy the experience less, they perceive the wine to be of lower quality, even if it's the exact same wine that they were given and told that it was more expensive. So I think there is definitely a psychological tendency to perceive higher value from things that cost more. We all like to think that we're not affected by advertising, but companies do spend a lot of time and energy making sure that their products, their logos, and their catchphrases are front and center in our minds when we're making purchasing decisions. So from this slide, I'd like you to take a second to look at these logos and think about how many of these symbols you recognize, and also how many products or services you can associate with these labels. I know for myself, looking at them, I recognize all but one and can certainly name a number of products associated with each of these labels or services. And so this just tells us that advertising has done its job. And studies have also found that even 3-year-olds are very brand savvy and they're aware of what's being advertised, what brands are desirable, and they use that knowledge to help make purchasing decisions. And as a mom, I can definitely attest to this when I take my children grocery shopping. All right, so now let's look a little bit more at brand versus generic medications. Now, just to make sure that we're on the same page, I thought we should start with a definition of what is actually a brand name medication versus a generic one. So brand name, also known as innovator drugs, are new chemical compounds authorized for sale in Canada. So this is a new drug for a new indication, and it has never been marketed before. These medications are patented, so they're protected by a patent for a period of 20 years in total, which awards them market exclusivity. So that means that the innovator company has the exclusive rights to sell and market that particular chemical entity. Now, drug discovery and development is a very lengthy process that is full of dead ends. So drug products or new drugs tend to be patented fairly early in the drug approval process. So by the time they actually get on the market or are approved to be marketed, they have approximately usually 8 to 10 years remaining on their patent. So that period of patent protection is meant to help innovator companies recuperate the extensive research and development costs associated with bringing a new drug to market. This allows them a period of time where they won't have any competition. They can set whatever price they think is fair for their product, and again, hopefully recuperate some of their investment. So this helps to stimulate innovation in drug discovery and development. Let's face it, if there was no monetary reward for drug discovery and development, companies would be much less excited to invest time and resource into it. The disadvantage of brand name drugs is, of course, that they tend to be expensive, and particularly while they are still on patent and have market exclusivity. But even once generic products are brought to market, the brand name product is still usually more expensive. All right, so generic medications. Generics are effectively chemical copies of the brand name or innovator drug. So they're required to contain the same active ingredient, so the same medication, in the same formulation. So that means that if the branded drug is a tablet, the generic medication also needs to be a tablet as well. Where generic drugs can be a little bit different is in the inactive ingredients that are formulated with the active medication. So this can include fillers that are present in tablets, binders that help to hold tablets together, and coloring. And so this is part of the reason why generic medications may look different than their brand name counterparts. It's also really important to know that generic medications will only be approved for use once the brand name drug's patent has expired. So once again, the brand name company has that period of time to exclusively market their new chemical compound, but once the patent expires, then other drug companies can look to have their generic medication or their chemical copy authorized for sale in Canada. All right, so now just looking at the approval process for generic drugs and what this looks like in Canada. So it's really important to know that Health Canada is responsible for regulating and approving all brand name drugs that are marketed in Canada, and they're also responsible for approving the right of generic companies to market their drug company in Canada as well. So an often heard myth is that generic medications aren't regulated like brand name drugs are, and this is just not true. Health Canada actually has very stringent requirements for generic manufacturers that they need to demonstrate they have good manufacturing practices. And the standard for manufacturing practices for companies making generic drugs is the same as for companies making branded drugs. And Health Canada does regularly perform audits and inspections to ensure compliance with good manufacturing practices for both branded and generic name drugs. Excuse me. Generic drugs are also required to demonstrate bioequivalence to the brand name product. And bioequivalence effectively means that there would be no expected difference in efficacy or safety between the generic and the brand name drug. This is a really important concept, even though it's getting to be a little bit sciencey and into the weeds. But I do think it's important to take a moment and just unpack what exactly bioequivalence is. So once again, generic drugs are required to demonstrate that they're bioequivalent to the brand name drug. So they're not required to do the same clinical studies of drug effectiveness and safety that the brand name drug has done in order to get a drug approved for a certain indication. But what they are required to demonstrate is that blood levels of the generic medication after someone takes it are equivalent to the branded medication. And so this is important because if a medication is absorbed to the same extent and reaches the same maximum as well as overall concentration in our bloodstream, then that means there's the same amount of medication available to exert both pharmacologic or therapeutic effect as well as a potential side effect. And so scientific experts and clinicians have determined the standards for bioequivalence, and generic companies must have an average blood level within a margin of error of 80 to 125% of the brand name medication. And so this is often misinterpreted that the generic drug can contain 80 to 125% of the actual active ingredient, and this isn't the case. So this is referring to disparities in particular blood levels. Studies looking at the level of active medication between generic and brand name drugs have found a much smaller variability with an average of less than 4%. So the active medication concentration really can't differ very much in order to produce these bioequivalent blood levels. Also, I think it's reassuring to know that Health Canada has among the most stringent requirements for bioequivalence in the world. So generic companies are held to a really high standard in order to have their medication approved as being a generic of a branded medication. We also have a different set of standards for some medications that are designated to be critical dose drugs. And so these are drugs that have a smaller window for error between their therapeutic effect and the development of toxicity or side effects. So for these drugs, blood levels within 10% on either side of the brand name medication's blood levels are the accepted margin of error. And so some examples of medications that are held to this higher standard are medications for seizure disorders or immunosuppressants to help prevent organ rejection after transplantation. So medications that have a really, really fine balance between therapeutic and toxic effects are held to an even higher standard than general medications are. All right, so why generic drugs? What role do generic medications play in our healthcare system? And so basically generic medications generate competition in the marketplace, which helps to bring the price of medications down and therefore helps make medications more accessible to a broader population of patients. All right, so if generic drugs are expected to be of the same effectiveness and safety as brand name medications, why are generic drugs cheaper? And I guess the key here is that researching, developing, and then conducting clinical trials to demonstrate effectiveness and safety of new drugs or new chemical compounds is a significant investment of both time and money. And so this innovator drug companies bear all of those costs when they're developing new drugs to bring to market. Generic companies don't have to invest this type of money into either drug discovery and development or these in-depth clinical studies before marketing the medication. So they have much less background costs to recuperate as compared to brand name companies. And so this is why they're able to price generic medications much lower than the brand name medication. In Canada, approximately 75% of prescriptions dispensed are for generic medications. And so depending what province you're in, some provincial drug plans have automatic substitution in place, which means that the pharmacist at the pharmacy is actually required to dispense the lowest cost equivalent alternative. So that would be usually a generic of a brand name medication if one is available. And so this saves both the healthcare system as well as individual patients substantial amounts of money and also helps to keep insurance plans affordable. So looking at 2021 data, the average price per prescription of a generic medication was just under $20, whereas the average price for a brand name medication was just under $115. So as you can see, a fairly significant price difference between brand name and generic medications. Some studies have found that medication adherence, or the amount of patients taking their medications as directed by a healthcare provider, actually improves when generic medications are used. And this is likely due to enhanced affordability. So people are less reluctant to take medications as directed, and they don't feel like they need to perhaps make their medications last when they're more affordable. On the other hand, though, there have been other studies done that have actually found the opposite, so that adherence might actually decrease with the use of generic medications. And I think what this boils down to is that some patients have unanswered questions about switching to generic medications and may feel that receiving a lower cost medication means that they're receiving a lower quality medication. So this is where I think pharmacists and physicians can potentially play a bigger role in speaking about these issues and hopefully helping to dissuade some of these common concerns about the quality of generic medications and why they're being used. All right, so we've talked about bioequivalence and how generic medications need to have approximately the same blood levels in the body in order to be deemed bioequivalent and to be approved to come on the market. But what about clinical outcomes? So do generic drugs perform as well at the reasons that we're taking them? So for example, at lowering blood pressure or cholesterol. So there have been numerous independent clinical studies conducted that have not found a significant difference in either safety or effectiveness between generic versus brand name medications. And so there's a lot more than this, but I've listed a few references here of cardiovascular medications as well as medications for seizure disorders that include a number of studies in their analysis. Now, if you do your own searching on the internet, you'll also find a lot of studies supporting the other conclusion. And what I think is really important to know when you're looking at studies of brand name versus generic name drugs is that it's really important that individuals enrolled in the study don't know whether they're receiving the branded or generic name product. There's a phenomenon called the nocebo effect, which basically just means that people that expect that they're receiving an inferior product will actually have poorer outcomes than those that expect that they're receiving a superior product. So it's important to make sure that when you're evaluating studies of drug effectiveness, people are blinded to whether they're receiving the generic versus the brand name drug, so that this doesn't have an impact on outcomes. All right, so now to discuss some of the myths versus facts about generic drugs. So a common myth is that generic drugs are not as effective as brand name drugs. And so in fact, manufacturers of generic drugs are required to use the same amount of active drug in the same formulation, and studies have found them to be equally effective for the condition that they are approved for. Another common myth is that an individual is more likely to have a side effect when they take a generic drug as compared to a brand name one. In fact, Health Canada actually monitors adverse effect reports for all drugs that are approved in Canada, whether they're branded or generic name drugs, and has found that generic drugs are no more likely to cause an adverse effect than brand name drugs are. And that most of the adverse effects reported to Health Canada are in fact due to the active ingredient or the medication itself, as opposed to the what form of the drug or who manufactured the drug. Another common myth is that generic drugs do not undergo testing and regulatory approval and are therefore not as predictable as the brand name product. And so I hope our talk today has informed you of the process that's required for generic drugs in order to be approved in Canada. And they are quite tightly regulated, and manufacturing processes are regularly inspected. Final myth, generic drugs are not as strong as brand name ones and therefore don't work as well in the body. In fact, generic drugs are required to demonstrate that they're equivalent to brand name drugs in the quality, strength, purity, and stability of the medication before approval. So generic drug manufacturers are required to demonstrate that it is going to deliver the same amount of active drug within the same period of time as the brand name drug, within that margin of error that we spoke about previously. All right, so in conclusion, There are many myths about the inferiority of generic medications. I think in Canada, we're extremely lucky. As I already mentioned, Health Canada has very stringent regulations for generic products, and I think we can be assured that generics marketed in Canada are high quality and held to high manufacturing standards. All of this being said, though, if you have specific concerns about a medication that you're taking in terms of its effectiveness or safety, it's always important to speak with your doctor and or your pharmacist to get another opinion on how best to manage that. So this is true of, for example, if you switch from a brand name product to a generic product and notice something different, or if you're at the pharmacy and you're dispensed tablets that are a different color or that look different than what you had previously. Again, it might just be a different brand of generic medication, but stopping to double check and making sure is always a good idea, and advocating for your health remains important. All right, so that is it for my section, and I will be happy to answer any of your questions after Helena is done speaking.
All right. Thank you very much, Erin. That was a very interesting, very informative presentation. Very much appreciate that. Our second speaker this afternoon is Helena Miller, Manager Group Products, Group Medical Services, GMS. Helena is passionate about group benefits. She has a wealth of knowledge and experience from 20 years of working in the industry. From group benefits underwriter to manager of group underwriting, and her current role as manager of group products, she has handled complex cases and helped both large and small groups find solutions that are fair and competitive. As the lead for group products at GMS, she reviews trends, identifies gaps and opportunities for customers and GMS alike, while enabling sound business performance. Helena earned her Certificate Employee Benefit Specialist designation in 2012 and is a member of the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans. She sits on Canada Life and Health Insurance Association committees and working groups on behalf of GMS. Helena also works very closely with Group Benefits Committee of SRA and is a great friend of SRA's. Welcome, Helena, to our information session.
Thanks, Harold, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to talk about the insurance perspective and GMS perspective on generic drugs and how it impacts your plan. So plan management, I just want to give you a bit of a background of what kind of goes into plan management. And so really, drugs is the largest component of any health plan's program. And so as a result, it really does drive that overall sustainability and positive or negative plan performance over time. And, plan management, generic drugs is a very large part of that, but it is also, whether it's mandatory generic or it is that lowest cost alternative or is that physician substitution layer. And then as well, on top of those pieces, you also have your co-insurances, your co-payments, maximums, and dispensing fee deductibles. And so just from your guys' plan's perspective, the SRA plan includes that physician no substitution layer, along with a plan maximum and then that dispensing fee deductible on the drug program. So the drug coverage options that are really available from GMS and for this plan to ensure that we have that sustainability over the long term, because that's very important. Whether it's your plan or it's any plan that we're looking at, sustainability is key for everybody. So generic only is an option. And so that really is just the generics. There is no opportunity for brand name coverage, and everything that is brand would be declined. And so from a member perspective, that really means that they would be out of pocket 100% if they're taking a brand name option. And so then the option then becomes, do they switch into a generic or do they continue with a brand name drug and then bearing more cost? Physician no substitution is what you guys have today and really is about the brand being dispensed when the physician says absolutely not, can you substitute this at your pharmacy? And so again, you're not going to be out anything out of pocket because of course you have that no substitution written on that prescription. And what's important to note is that physician no substitution is applicable for that prescription. And so if you're on a maintenance drug and your prescription is a 6-month refill, if the physician doesn't always write no substitution at that next refill, then the pharmacist could substitute if that no substitution is not written by the physician. So just an important note there. And then the other option is lowest cost alternative. This is the GMS standard offering. And so it's really the option that is going to pay for that generic or the brand. But if the brand is dispensed, we're only going to pay to the cost of that lowest generic equivalent would be, where there is an option to have the brand or the generic. So in the case where it's a new to market drug and there isn't a generic equivalent, of course, the brand would be paid. But in cases where there are options, we would pay up to the lowest cost alternative. So from a member perspective, what this really means is that you're going to be out of pocket if you decide to continue with a brand where there's a generic equivalent available. And so this could mean that from a perspective of the coinsurance and the deductible and the maximums, you could be out of pocket quite significantly by continuing with the brand option. But again, this plan and this option really gives the most flexibility to the member to make their own decision as to what they would like to have, and not necessarily impacting the cost of the plan at the same time. So getting into your own plan utilization, as Randy had mentioned in the opening there, drugs overall in the last 5 years are about 61% of your total drug claims. And you can see that of our other large categories that we track, drugs are significant compared to things like practitioner utilization or vision utilization. And so anything you do with drugs is really going to be what really changes the opportunity for sustainability for your plan. And so looking in these chart, what we can see as well, drugs spend has been increasing year over year for the last 5 years. The amount that has been changing every year has been slowing down a bit. And even getting to the fact that we think by the end of this renewal period, we do expect drugs to actually come in flat to what we've seen in the prior year. And so we do know that, drugs ebb and flow as more drugs come off patents. There was a few years back what the industry called the patent cliff, where we've seen a whole lot of new drugs to market come off and the generics coming back. And so there was a large decrease. I think that was about 6 or 7 years ago now. So from prescription drug utilization, while we know it's an overall component, what we also see is the top drugs are always the driver of a lot of that utilization. And so in this list, we can see that there's, a lot of drugs here that are brand name, but then as well, a lot of drugs that are treating chronic conditions, treating maintenance type of conditions that aren't going to go away and that are needed on a very frequent basis. So we can see that of these top 10 drugs, we see that 20% of that total spend of your drug plan is coming from these top 10 drugs. And that, it is a lot of brand name, it is newer to market drugs. So the opportunity might not be as effective, but it's still important to note that this is where a lot of the cost does come from. We can also see that the average day supply dispensed is about 47. So what we can see is that even though these are maintenance drugs, on the average, we're not dispensing at a 60 or a 90-day supply, and it is very much closer to just a 1 month supply at a time, which can get costly for the plan and it can get costly for the member. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're discussing with your physician and discussing with your pharmacist what those options are. And then again, the other important thing here to note is that your fill rate. And so fill rate is really the type of drugs that are being consumed by the plan. And so those are into 3 buckets: acute medications, so things like a cream for a rash or a penicillin for an infection. Maintenance are those chronic conditions I mentioned, so diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, things like that. And then the specialty, which could be things like biologic or things that generally cost more than $10,000 in any 1 year. And so for your plan, a lot of the spend, over 80%, is coming from those chronic conditions. So again, it's really important that we think about generics in terms of the maintenance conditions and then, even those fill rates as we're considering those generic medications. And so what is interesting though, is when I took your plan and compared it to our pharmacy benefit manager, Express Scripts Canada, that this utilization is quite similar. So that was comforting to know that your plan is actually performing very similar to an entire book of business that's quite substantial within the industry. So when we kind of break it back now into the generics and these multi-source brand or the single source brand, what we can see in the first chart on the right is The generics are representing about 76% or 77% year to date. And then we have an opportunity within the multi-source brand and a little bit more in the single source brand as well. So then when we look in terms of over the last 5 years, what we've seen is that there's actually quite a significant utilization of the physician no substitution, which you can see on the chart on the right, which is that orange bar. It might be a little harder to see. And then what's even more worrisome is that that gray bar is actually where the members are choosing to have a brand dispensed when there's a generic option available. So they're paying significant out-of-pocket costs when there is a very equivalent generic available to them. And so this worries because, you know, it impacts the member's pocketbook when they're paying for things out of pocket, because these drugs can be significant, as Aaron mentioned, that $114. So there's lots of opportunity that we see within this plan in terms of the physician no substitution and educating more about switching to those generic options versus continuing on with a brand name drug. So to give you an example, this kind of qualifies what Erin had shown in her example. So what we did is we looked at 3 real-time claims from claimants over the last 3 months of 2022. And so we picked some very normal utilized drugs that we see a lot within the plan. So we can see that if we look at the total brand cost, it's anywhere from $90 to $47, depending on the drug chosen. The generic cost, though, is quite significantly less, 80 to 90% less than what that brand. So really, the potential savings over the last few months of 2022 for three claims would have been $196 in savings. So when you start to multiply this through the opportunity through the whole program, because there's well over 2,000 members within this program, this is where I say that there is significant opportunity here. And to Aaron's point, there are great generics that are available for these particular drugs that are as effective and are as secure as the brand name without that cost to the member. So from an industry perspective, I actually pulled this chart from the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical and the Patent and Medication Price Review Board, which are committees organized by the Government of Canada. And so this has been really interesting when you look over the 12 years between 2006 and 2018, there's significant increases in generic utilization. And then at the same time, you can see that orange bar is a decreasing line in terms of the share of sales, because we've been decreasing in the total cost of that, the cost of that actual generic drug. The government has been able to reduce that cost to an individual. So we've really been able to see a positive spin on increasing the utilization of those generic drugs. And at the same time, the government is continuing to decrease the cost of that generic drug to the individual. So, for people in limited budgets or plans with maximums such as this one, it makes that maximum go that much further, because now there's more spend because the generic cost is that much less. And it's interesting to note that in the United States, the generic utilization back in 2018 was already over 80%. And that was 5 years ago. So that's very interesting to see that the US is actually outpacing Canada at that particular point. And then this is just a report from TELUS Health. So again, they're a pharmacy benefit manager within Canada, and they have a significant book of business amongst all the carriers. And so what we can see over the last 5 years, again, between 2017 and 2021, is that generic utilization has increased by about 5%. And now this chart breaks it down between the various cohorts of Canada. So Atlantic, the West, which is kind of where this plan obviously falls, and then Canada overall. And so within Canada overall, the TELUS book is at about 64%. Express Script Canada, which is the pharmacy benefit manager that GMS utilizes, is a little higher at 76%. And I think that's, again, the difference there is the combination of all the groups that are utilized. And so there's a few government plans that are using the Express Scripts Canada, which is why I think that the generic utilization comes out a little bit higher overall. And, regardless of the reporting source, what's very interesting is that Atlantic Canada has always had a higher generic utilization than the rest of Canada. So this is just some background information for your guys' perspective. And so overall, from my perspective, being in the insurance industry, generic utilization is just one piece to achieving that sustainable plan management. And it's really about how all the pieces are coming together. So your generic options, your provincial interventions, your maximums, co-insurances, frequencies, prior authorizations, and then the other plans that you have access to as individuals. So that's it for me. That's all I had. I hope this was informative for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Helena. That's a lot of information for our members to take in. But this is now we move to an opportunity for you, the members out there, to ask some questions of our two guests. And so we're going to certainly, I hope questions have come in as we've been speaking, and I'm going to push it over to Lyle to see what questions he may have gathered from our members.
Good day. I have a few questions. I'll start with one from Cliff. Does the generic and brand name drugs have the same footprint, same shape, or embossed symbol?
So that's a great question. So regarding the footprint, I'm going to assume that means shape. But please feel free to clarify if I'm off base there. But basically, this is where generic products can differ quite a bit from brand name products. So they can differ in terms of appearance, shape, color, size, all of those various factors. So I guess the short answer is no, generic products don't necessarily have the same appearance or other factors as brand name products do.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Noreen. When I order a prescription, how do I know if I'm purchasing a generic or a brand drug?
So that's a really great question about how you know whether or not you're purchasing a generic or a brand name medication. Generic medications will usually it's usually a 3-digit or 4-digit company name in front of the chemical name. So you'll see, for example, RAN and then amlodipine for the company, or Teva lisinopril as just kind of examples. You can also tell because brand names will usually list both a brand as well as a generic name. So you would see, for example, Plavix and then clopidogrel in brackets on the label, but that's one way that it would tell you that it's a branded product. But I guess really at the end of the day, the easiest way to tell is just to ask your pharmacist if you're not sure. And they'll be able to tell you whether it was a brand name product or a generic product that was dispensed. And then if you have any further questions about, availability of generics or brands and that sort of thing. But that's sort of, I guess, one way to tell on your own whether it's a generic or a branded product.
I have a question from Brian. Why does my healthcare provider sometimes say no substitution on my prescription if there's no difference to the generic?
That's a very interesting question. And I certainly can't speak for all providers in terms of why they choose to do that. Sometimes it is a patient preference. So it is an individual that has said, they'd prefer the brand or whatever. It sounds like that's not the case here though. And this is actually kind of the provider making the choice. I guess at the end of the day, I will say that providers have different experiences and different perhaps biases with respect to medication use and may feel quite strongly that a brand is what is more effective of one particular drug than another. And whether or not that's based on empirical evidence versus, clinical experience and gut feeling. I say would probably just depend on the practitioner. But the best thing to do in that situation would be just to ask your provider what their reason is for preferring the brand over the generic of this particular product, and especially if that does have cost implications for you.
Question from Kathy. What percentage of similarities does there need to be between brand name and generic effectiveness?
Okay, so I guess I'm going to take a stab at answering this question, and then if I'm not on the right track, please feel free to resubmit and clarify for my understanding. So I'm going to kind of answer the question, assuming that that means the allowable standard for changes in blood levels between what's achieved with the brand name drug versus the generic medication. And so for most drugs, blood levels need to be within 80 to 125% of what is achieved with the brand name drug with a generic medication. And then, like I said, for some of the critical dose drugs, it needs to be between 90 and 112% with respect to blood levels of the brand name versus the generic drug.
Question from Laverne. Physician no substitution would be the best option for us as a plan customer, but we need to ensure that we get the prescription that the doctor puts on no substitution on the prescription. I think I read that right. Prescription that the doctor do not put no substitution on the prescription. So
So that it feels like a bit of a statement. So that is what the plan is today, is that if a doctor writes physician no substitution on the form, the pharmacist obviously is going to adhere to that, dispense the brand name drug, and then the plan is going to, pay the full cost of that brand name drug. And that's where the other option could be the lowest cost alternative, removing no physician as an option entirely, so that, in the cases where there is a generic, the generic would then be dispensed by the pharmacist, and thereby, giving the plan the most sustainable and most stable claims utilization pattern possible.
Okay. Question from Celeste. Should we be checking with our pharmacy to ensure that our prescriptions are generic if available, or will they automatically replace them if the physician has said no substitution?
So that's a really great question. If the physician has not specified no substitution, then the pharmacy is obligated to dispense the lowest cost medication or generic that's available. So that wouldn't be something that you would have to check. That would be something that they are contractually obligated to just do automatically.
Okay. Question here is, problems with using generic drugs is an inactive ingredient such as give color, texture, which can be quite different from what is used in brand name companies. How does this impact the quality of generic drug in general? And does this pose risks to using generic drugs?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. And we did talk about this a little bit, how the inactive ingredients used by generic companies can be different versus the brand name product. And so this is what leads to generic products often looking different than the brand name medication, and also which sometimes leads to confusion when people receive their medication and all of a sudden it looks different if that isn't explained upfront by the pharmacy. And so I guess the short answer to this question is that the inactive medication or the inactive fillers that are mixed in with the medication would not be expected to impact either the efficacy or safety, because the studies that are done to check blood levels would find out if the fillers were somehow interfering with the medication in any way. And there's actually a pretty, I guess, short list of products that are approved to be used in medications that are considered to be inactive. And so if they were to somehow have an unforeseen effect on the medication absorption, that is something that should come out in the studies that look at medication absorption once it's administered. The long answer is, though, that there is the odd person that has an intolerance or an allergy to certain ingredients that can be used as fillers in medications. So this is where if you do have an allergy to something like an inactive ingredient, like, for example, lactose or certain food dyes or colorings or those sorts of things, this is where it might be important to work with your pharmacist and make sure that the ingredients in any medication that you receive don't contain products that you're actually allergic to. So again, that's fairly rare, but it does happen. And that's a case where you would really need to work with your pharmacist to make sure that both brand and generic products are going to be safe for you.
Okay. Question from Ken is, I had a pharmacist question the use of an expensive drug, brand name drug. He phoned the doctor to recommend a lower cost generic drug, which is the doctor agreed to. Is this very common?
Yeah, it is certainly something that your pharmacist can advocate for if you have concerns that or if they have concerns that a medication that's going to be a higher cost and a higher burden to you is being recommended over a lower cost alternative. So I think it's very reasonable for the pharmacist to have that conversation with the prescriber and get their rationale or their perspective on why they're recommending that, and perhaps offering, again, a lower cost alternative to hopefully help alleviate the associated costs with the therapy.
Thanks. I think this was covered, but I'll ask it again. SRA plan, if it moves to use of generics, but I still want to use brand names, could I do this? Or would I be forced to use generic drugs regardless of the personal interests?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. And so, no, we wouldn't require that you use the generic. What's going to happen, though, at the time of fill at the pharmacy is that the pharmacy will reimburse up to, or will charge up to the lowest cost alternative. We'll cover that portion. And then what we're going to say to the pharmacist is whatever's left over between the cost of the brand drug and the cost of the generic is now the patient's responsibility. And so that's where there could be very much more cost out of pocket as a member to go this route. But again, it's definitely your choice and your perspective. And so that's where, we're trying to offer the most help, but then at the same time, most sustainability as well.
Thank you. Follow-up question from Noreen. I know we want to keep the costs down. Could you summarize the top 2 or 3 things we should do at our next trip to the pharmacy in order to ensure we can reduce cost?
So maybe I'll kind of give my perspective and then Aaron can jump in. So from my perspective, it is having that conversation. It's asking the pharmacist the question, was I dispensed the generic today? Is there a generic option if I wasn't dispensed the today? And really even then, maybe even before that, having that conversation with my physician to say, hey, this is what I'm covered for. This is how SRA is covering my drugs. What are you dispensing and how is that going to be impacted by the plan? So that's kind of what I would think is the best steps as a member. So.
Yeah, and just again, to kind of build on that, sometimes there are medications that a pharmacist can recommend that would cost less and still require a prescription. So it's not necessarily a generic. But for example, within the family of medications that lower acid secretion in your stomach to help with heartburn and other conditions like that, there's a lot of different medications within that same category that work similarly, but have substantially different costs associated with them. And so your pharmacist would be a good person to say, well, hey, you're taking the most expensive acid reducing medication. Maybe we could talk to your doctor and look at switching you over to a lower cost alternative. So yeah, I think for sure reaching out to your pharmacist and your physician to have those discussions is a great step if you're looking to reduce costs.
You. One of our questions that we gave you earlier, how is the cost of generics in Canada compared to the cost of generics in other countries?
Oh, so this is a really interesting question. Traditionally, the cost of generic medications in Canada has actually been quite a bit more expensive than other leading countries. Over the last, 4 or 5 years, there's been a lot of work to try to narrow that gap and to make the pricing of generic medications more affordable and more in line with what it is in other countries. And so I think the latest data that I've seen that's available is from 2018, 2019, and it does look like we are narrowing that gap fairly significantly. So generic drugs in Canada are becoming a lot more affordable compared to other countries. But for a long time, we were a bit of an outlier in terms of affordability. So that is changing for the better, which is great, but it also does take some time.
Okay. I'll just pause for a minute. If anybody else has any more questions, they can submit them on the page. I'll ask one more of our questions that we did. Which one was it now? Sorry. What level of studies have been done that would demonstrate scientifically that generics provide the same intended response in users of brand names with no negative impact on health issues?
Yeah, so that's, pardon me, a really good question. And there have been a fair number of studies that have been done by independent investigators and academics like myself that conduct these sorts of studies. Just as a reminder, studies that look at clinical outcomes are not required by Health Canada from generic manufacturers. So that's not something that's done routinely with every medication that is approved as a generic. But there have been lots of studies done and good quality, randomized controlled trials, which is what we look for when we're assessing the effective or the quality of a study, that have demonstrated that generic drugs perform just as well in terms of impact on clinical outcomes of interest, and then also that they don't seem to cause any more side effects. And then there have also been various analyses of these trials, again, trying to look for small differences that haven't really found clinically significant differences between brand versus generic. So even though this is something that isn't routinely done at the regulator level, it is something that has been investigated quite rigorously. And for the most part, I think we can be fairly reassured by the results that have been found from those studies.
Thank you. Jake's been asked for a specific drug, but I'll just ask his question. What causes a generic drug to be unavailable?
Oh, that's a really, really good and really complicated question that's having a fairly large impact on our healthcare system at the moment. There's a lot of different factors that go into, that can impact generic medication availability. And some of what's being, pointed to as contributors to the current problems we're having with our drug supply chain is just kind of consolidation of medication manufacturing. So over time, there are fewer and fewer plants available to make these drugs. And so if one plant has a problem, whether that's a quality assurance problem or whether, it's everyone's off sick with COVID problem, it impacts the drug supply chain in a really significant way. And so we've seen that with impurities that have been found in some of the medications that have had to be recalled from the market. And then there's no one else that can make the drug anymore. So we're just left with a gap in that supply chain until the drug manufacturer can get their processes back in order. So I certainly there's a lot more factors to it than just that, but I think that's one of the big ones that countries like Canada and the United States are wrestling with is, outsourcing our production does leave us vulnerable when, when there are supply chain issues and that sort of thing. So there's no easy answer to that, unfortunately, but it is something that the healthcare system is really struggling with right now. And I'm sure many of you have noticed at the pharmacy in terms of having to have medications changed to a different product because something's not available. And it's frustrating for everyone for sure.
Thank you. If you qualify for a seniors drug plan in Saskatchewan, does that affect the cost of our plan for any brand name or generic drugs? Shelley asked this question.
So from what I can understand of the seniors drug plan, the province is bearing the cost. So what kind of comes through as the plan cost is really what the government is charging that retiree. And so the part that the plan is responsible for, we would still pay. And so in some way, I do think it does help, most definitely. But to what degree, I'm not really super confident on commenting on right now. So I don't know, Erin, if you have anything to add from that perspective.
Yeah, I don't really. I'm not. So the seniors drug plan will usually cover down to the $25 copay. And then does your plan cover the remaining $25?
It does. Yes. Okay. So that they pay a dispensing fee deductible, but then really if the cost is $25, then the plan is going to pick up that $25, and then the dispensing fee is the deductible the member pays. So I do believe it does help comparative to what the cost of the drug could have been. But yeah, to what degree we would need to do an analysis to really pinpoint that. So.
And Bev asked this question, I think we had it covered, but if the generic drug is unavailable, does our plan cover the brand name drug then?
Absolutely. So in cases where there is a gap or there is some unavailability of that generic medication, we are going to cover it without reducing the cost to the member if that's the scenario. So absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And I've had quite a few people ask about dispensing fees. We will answer this question on our website so they can get the answer for that question. So it's save some time. As of this point, I have no other questions, so I can turn it back to Randy.
Okay, thank you, Lyle, and thank you, members, for those great questions. There was lots there, and watching our two presenters, I think caused them a little bit of need to think about how to respond to those, and that's always good. So we thought we don't want to throw too many softballs to you today. So that's those are good questions. Let me then thank both of you again, Erin and Helena, for your presentation, your comments, and members. Thanks for the good questions. If you have other questions or comments, you can send them into our email account at info@saskretirees.org, and we'll be happy to try and respond to them there. As Lyle has said, and we'd said earlier, that the questions that have come in and questions that perhaps weren't asked here live will be captured, and we will respond to them and publish them on our website at saskretirees.org. And that's so you can look for that in the coming days as we get things organized around this. So with all this information, and question might be, so what? What do we do with this now? And so what the Group Benefits Committee at SRA, in conjunction with Group Medical Services, with Helena and others there, will be doing is looking at this issue, looking at your feedback, looking at what we may be able to do in terms of generic drugs, and that will be part of the discussion as the group decides on whatever changes may be needed for 23-24. As part of the process that this committee works through essentially every winter in order to come back to members in May with decisions about what may happen on coverages and what will happen to premium rates and that. And so the latest information on the premium side, or the claim side, I should say, is that as of December, we're tracking reasonably well according to where we should be. Our health plan is pretty much on target. Our dental plan's a little bit higher than target, but we're not way off this year. So that's some good news at this point with the plan. I mean, it's just halfway through that renewal year, so we'll see how that goes as we move forward and that. So, but some good news there. So, okay, with that then, we will just move forward. We're just approaching sort of rolling this towards a conclusion for the day. There will be future webcasts. And we have now confirmed on February 23rd, we will have a speaker from PIBA giving us working through a workshop that they provide generally to PIBA members, of which many of you, or maybe most of you, are. And so that'll be on post-retirement planning. And so that will be a similar webcast to this. Watch for announcements and watch for registration information, but that's February 23rd. We are working again with the University of Saskatchewan on a session on nutrition and healthy lifestyles that will be presented in March. We're just working out the details of that. And then through the spring, we will have an update on the whole question of independent living and the home supports initiative coming from the Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism. So that you can look forward to. We don't have a date on that at this stage, but those are coming attractions as we push down this series of webcasts to get information to you. I would remind you that our annual meeting is on May 25th. If you don't have that in your calendar, we'd ask you to consider putting it in. And we'll be, of course, reporting on the operations of the Retirees Association and any changes in direction that come forward as a result of this kind of a webcast and other things that we're doing over the course of the year. So that will be happening there. With that, I think I would again like to thank both Aaron and Helena, and also Harold and to Lyle for your participation today. We don't put these on without the talents and skills and contribution of many. I'd also thank Terry Scott from VoiceWorks and Webcast Canada for helping with the production. Terry helps us all look good, and hopefully looks good on the other side for those that are viewing, and so thanks to that. So I think with that, we'll call it a day. So thank you for your participation. Thanks for joining us. And I would say now on behalf of the group, thanks, enjoy your day, and we'll see you next time in February. So take care and see you soon.